Next year we will mark 40 years since that dark day forever etched into the city's memory, Bloody Sunday, when the British Army shot 26 and murdered 14 civilians in a manner that, in the words of Saville, was both unjustified and unjustifiable. As we gather to celebrate Black History Month, the narratives of people of colour, I am reminded of the fact that the Irish people are perhaps unique among Western European nations in having shared historical, cultural and Jungian currency with those of us with roots in the global South. This shared currency is perhaps best put in the words of my fellow Dub, Imelda May: you don't get to be racist and Irish. Colonialism and racism at their roots are about erasure. Erasure of rights, erasure of identity, and eventual erasure of self-esteem. On my drive to you today, at an arbitrary point between Monaghan and Omagh, the native language of this island disappeared from the road signs. Erasure of rights. Such erasure is not just a key theme point in the history of the Irish nation, but a key theme in the oppression of minorities and colonized people all over the world. And if anyone is laboring under the delusion that this is history, this is the past, let me assure you, this is not. This erasure continues until today. I see friends here from the Belfast Multicultural Association. BMCA's premises are a place of worship for Muslims, particularly North Muslim community, were gutted in an arson attack the PSNI described as a deliberate hate crime in January this year. As of now, no arrests have been made. Erasure of a place of history, place of worship. Erasure from policing. On the 21st of June 2020 last year, a young black boy called Noah Donoghue disappeared from the streets of Belfast. His body was found in a storm drain 6 days later. Nearly 18 months on, his mother Fiona waits for answers with the dignity and, yes, a pain that few of us will ever understand. Out of respect, I will not mention the names of any other missing children, for they are innocent. But I am not wrong in saying that if Noah had been a white child, perhaps from the home counties of England, the response of policing would not have been so inadequate. Erasure of justice. Erasure of a beautiful young life. I am a father of 3 wonderful children. I want to extend my solidarity, the love and the prayers of a parent to Fiona today. This erasure, these imbalances are compounded by the continuing partition of this island we all call home. For a large part of the past decade, people living in the 26 counties could marry the person they loved, no matter who that was. That was not the case in the 6 counties. Erasure of love. This erasure exists on the most practical level. An Egyptian, Pakistani or Nigerian doctor or nurse employed on a work visa in Letterkenny Hospital cannot legally travel from their place of work in Letterkenny to a supermarket in Derry. A British citizen from London or Manchester, however, with no connections to the area, can fly into Derry and cross the border as they please without any restrictions. Erasures of the contribution to their community. Intimidation, racist abuse and attacks remain all too common in the north, while the racial equal strategy has remained in limbo for more than a decade. I would like to commend Northwest Migrants Forum on the recent breakthrough in this regard and remind policymakers of their duty to follow through on their commitments. Let there be no more erasure. And so I want to finish with a message of hope. Dahad Aniha, Tagan Allah. No matter how long the night, the day will come. Brexit, discussions around the protocol, and indeed the ongoing promise of that hopeful day in 1998 that gave us the Good Friday Agreement presents us an opportunity for a new social contract, a new public discourse, a new way of sharing this island. Everyone in this room, male or female, young or old, nationalist, unionist or other, black, white or Asian, straight or LGBTQI, everyone has a role to play in that discussion and a voice that should be heard. Let no one's voice ever be erased again. Let's speak to one another. Let's listen to one another. Let's trust one another. Because no matter where you are born, where you're from, what your story is, or what color your skin is, or anything else, you know, being a Derry girl, it's all about state of mind.
Thank you for that lovely speech. Thank you. It was really, really powerful. Can we please welcome Bishop Donald McNaugh?
Thank you very much. Shukran, or whatever else I should be saying. I suppose, like Bishop Andrew, I am migrant to Derry. I can't quite say that I was expelled as a refugee from Belfast. But I do know a little of what it means to come from a different place. Having worked, studied abroad for 6 years in my early years, I have some idea, a little idea, of what's involved in settling in a new environment, making friendships, feeling strange at times. But what I can say from my own experience of this city here, it actually is a wonderful community. And we saw that during the summer with so many visitors coming, saying marvellous people. So Derry is not ultimately a place that needs to be dragged and forced to accept the outsider. I think this place has shown over the past number of decades that actually is a place that wants to show the best of society, how we can live with difference and how we can celebrate difference. Remember, as one Hector said a long time ago when I was involved in a school debate, colour, it's only a pigment of the imagination. So I welcome this opportunity to be part of an important gathering that I hope people will look back to, and thanks to Lillian and Amy and everybody else for putting so much work into getting this going. Just because we think of ourselves, however, in the city as being welcoming and open, doesn't mean we don't have to listen to the experience of others. So this is a chance to listen as human beings to one another and to be enriched by that. I think we all know, wherever you go around the world, that Derry has an experience that it's through relationships that ultimately we can overcome differences and problems. In some places, this is turning out to be an age with a renewed emphasis on angry nationalisms and fractious identity politics. So the purpose of today is not to create a new subgroup of angry people in our society, but to find ways of cherishing both diversity and unity. It's easy to divide up society into little groups of identically minded people who have room only for those who subscribe to their set of principles. The real challenge for us as a modern, multicultural society is to create a unity that is enriched by difference, not one that feels threatened by the other. So I hope that today, together, we can not fight with anyone, but reach out the hand of friendship to everyone. My favourite poster when I was going abroad in the early 70s is one I have for 47 years now. It showed a little human figure made up of lots of tiny little human beings. And the caption simply says, "None of us is as smart as all of us." I pray that today will help us to both welcome difference and to push so that legislation protects diversity. So every journey is made up of many small steps. Someone gave me good advice many years ago. He said, never overestimate what you can do in a year. Never underestimate what you can do in 10 years. So I hope that today is an important one of these little steps as this community tries to set out an example of what a richly diverse society can be like. Yes, we know the pain of conflict based on fearing difference. But in this city we pledge ourselves to remember the millions who pass through our port here, heading to make a better life in other lands. In their name can we pledge ourselves to make this a great community to come to, not want to leave anymore. Thank you very much.
all right for this, reflect on the remarks we just had. And I remember, well, just a few minutes ago, Bishop Donor Wicknell said we should never underestimate and we shouldn't overestimate the effect that we can have. Sheikh Umar said the state of the mind. So I want you guys to just take a moment to reflect on the remarks and give them a round of applause, because these remarks were really powerful, and I as a person have taken insight or have seen life from a different perspective just listening to these three powerful speakers. So can we just like give them a round of applause?
Thank you all for your powerful remarks. We all have questions, like why is this event significant? How will it impact us? Well, sit tight, because Naomi and myself will try to give more insight into Black history. Black History Month. What is it and why does it matter? Black History Month marks the month of October in UK. The event was officially recognized by the US government in 1976 and first celebrated in UK in 1987. Black history and why it matters to us. History connects the past to the present. It creates a link of understanding between past and present on conditions of a human being, of being human. Black history is not just useful, it is essential in tackling anti-Black prejudice and racism. History lessons are currently often a version written from the colonial viewpoint, and decolonizing means identifying why we are learning a story. Where did Black History Month originate? In 1926, Carter, an American whose parents were former slaves and who was educated, decided that it was an event worth celebrating. So he asked for a week of celebrations. It started in 1970. And in 1976, the US president designated a whole month because a week was too short. February coincides with the birth of former President Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery and became a key social activist. So February is being celebrated in America to mark these two people. Pan-African flag. The Pan-African flag was created in 1920 in response to a racially derogatory song and the realization that every race has a flag but the Black. The flag later became an African nationalist symbol for war-right liberation of people of African origin. As an emblem of Black pride, the flag became popular during the Black liberation movement of the 1960s. Black people around the world will be able to claim an identity of their own right under the flag. This is the flag and its colors: red, black, and green. Why is Black History Month necessary? People from African and Caribbean backgrounds have been a fundamental part of British and Irish history for centuries. The value and contribution of Black people to society here is often overlooked, ignored, or discarded. Black History Month gives everyone the opportunity to share, celebrate, and understand the impact of Black heritage and culture. It is an opportunity to explore and reflect on Black people's journey, existing events that shape their experiences across the world. And that DNA up there is mine. My diversity started when I was born. I was born in a country called Guyana. It was once a colonial state. To parents from 2 different countries. My mom is Barbadian, my father is Guyanese. And I always considered myself either South American or Caribbean. And when I came here, people asked me, where are you from? And I would say Guyana, and it says Ghana. And I says, no, Guyana. And I says, it's not Ghana. So then I found that I was more than where I represented. Everyone had a linkage back to Africa. And I was like, where do mine start? Where does mine start and where does it end? So then I went to do a DNA test. And I am 48% Ghana, 36% Nigerian, and guess what popped up there? 5.4% Irish. So, colonialism did play a major part. I'm living proof of that.
Thanks very much. This is part of a much larger talk on ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland, and I want to really try and make this local. A lot of the time we talk about Black History Month, we talk about globally, and we don't think locally. And I want to try and challenge you today. I want to try and challenge you because, sorry, bear with me. Because we tend to think of Black history as being for Black people. We don't tend to think about it's our history. Slavery is our story. I want to tell you a story that is inclusive. The ways in which Britain and Ireland have been shaped by its interactions with the wider world. To tackle the myth that Ireland is a racially pure society, particularly we look at an Ireland saying that I've heard many people say actually we were white until 15 years ago. That's not true. I want us to recognise that we have a long been culturally diverse nations. That's often overlooked when we're talking about the likes of the Huguenots or the Italians who moved to Ireland in the 1800s. But there have been Black, Asian and other ethnic minorities in the UK for centuries. We also need to recognise that the legacy of colonialism and slavery has affected us locally as well as globally. I'm going to focus today on the history of people of African origin, but we have to also recognise that it's not a homologous group of people. There are many diverse ethnicities, races and cultures within that. And I don't want to talk about a token inclusion of non-white cultures. We need to rethink and reshape how we view history. A culture shift to think more widely about why common knowledge is what it is, and adjusting our cultural perceptions and power relations in real and significant ways. One of the things that I was taught in school was about the great success story of British industrialisation. One example being the cotton and textile trade in the 17th to 19th centuries. What I was not taught, that the cotton was largely imported from the labour of the enslaved in the United States. The knowledge on textile manufacture was imported from India. British cotton exports went to territories in their empire to squash native markets. Therefore, there is a fundamental link between enslavement, empire, and British industrialisation. And first, it's really important to recognise that race is a constructed thing. There's no biological basis for it. The differentiation between white and non-white was constructed during the early modern period by people of Western European descent to justify slavery, colonialism, and racism. A growing pan-European identity saw white as a symbol of purity and virtue and ethnocentralism. And locally, it wasn't really recognised because up until 2001 we didn't even have ethnicity on the census. So this meant that minorised people within Northern Ireland were effectively rendered invisible. and our historical presence here has largely been ignored because all we're interested in is the tribal orange and green. And we have to see this the presence and the input of ethnic minority people in the wider context of colonialism, racism, integration and xenophobia in the UK and Ireland. So this surprises a lot of people, that there's evidence of people with African, largely North African ancestry in the Roman Britain. There are also sporadic records dating from medieval times of black and ethnic minority people in Britain and Ireland. Black people are represented in paintings of Henry VIII. By Elizabethan times, there were notable numbers of black people in Britain, and others were known as Turks who came from the Ottoman Empire. So much that Elizabeth I issued a proclamation against them. And one very link that maybe is in, if you did DNA tests like Beverly did, you might find some evidence of this as well. If you go back as far as the Vikings to 1806, there was the Vikings also were centred in Dublin, and they set off and took a host of hostages from North Africa, which they brought back to Ireland, and they lived as the blue men or the blonde men, which is the black men, for a considerable period of time in Ireland before becoming just part of the population. And one thing also, when we talk about slavery and colonialism, we do tend to think about Ireland as separate from that. We didn't have large numbers of slaves here, but Irish merchants did profit from the African slave trade. Sorry about the pop-out. Mostly indirectly as provisioners, so they're providing goods to the slavers, and they're also benefiting from the products that the slaves made. In addition, whenever slavery was banned in the British Empire, 107 people were compensated for their losses they incurred after it ended. There were also small numbers of slaves directly from Africa and indirectly through the Afro-Caribbean here in Ireland kept as slaves. And it's also important to note, and Beverly is a living example here, that Irish immigrants sometimes play key roles in slave societies in the Caribbean and North America. Montserrat being one example, where the Irish was the majority white population of the island, and many of them were slave owners. And this is an example. The top one is a very famous slave trader in America. John Ryan was Irish, and he was one of the slave traders in America. And at the bottom there we have examples of local Irish papers advertising slaves for sale and runaway slaves asking for them to be returned. So those people say there was no slavery in Ireland. Unfortunately, the evidence says differently. Black people have actually lived in Ireland from the 1700s. In 1750, the population is estimated anything from 1,000 to 3,000 people. Some of them were slaves, some of them were servants brought to Ireland. And these are actually paintings. Both of these paintings are Irish paintings. And you can see in the far left a servant, and here on the right someone as a groomsman. And unfortunately back then, the Irish, as I said, were abroad. They were in India, they were in the Caribbean, and it was fashionable to bring back home servants and to trade servants. The darker the skin, the more exotic they were, and the more valuable they were. And this was seen as a status symbol in 18th century Ireland. Unfortunately, because they are had these positions in society, their names are often lost to history. And when they are known, it's for something that notorious that happened. So we've got George Henry Thompson, which some of you may have heard of. He was a black man who lived among the Protestants of the Shankill in the 1860s, and he received a fine and 2 years imprisonment for inciting a riot. It was actually a riot against local Catholics, and there was 100 people involved, but he was the only one to get charged. And another thing we try and talk about, we generally talk about men, when we talk about immigration stories, but it's also important to remember that women are part of the story as well. One of them is Rachel Baptiste Pro. This isn't actually her, this is a contemporary of hers, because there's no living pictures of her, existing pictures of her. She was a popular Irish singer. She toured all around Ireland and the UK, including Belfast and Carrickfergus and Lisburn, where she spent her last days in the north of Ireland. And her last concert was in Belfast on the 30th of April in 1773. So over time we saw people come. A lot of people came through ships, So the Lascars, the sailors, different ways they came to Ireland and the UK, and that began to cause a bit of a moral panic. So the UK began to introduce immigration controls in the early 1900s. And really it was very much targeted at this fear that a lot of men from different backgrounds were coming and marrying Irish women and British women, and that wasn't very popular. So they actually introduced the British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act, and then the Coloured Aliens, excuse the terms, but this is the term they used, Alien Seamen's Order in 1925. So if you couldn't prove that you were British, a lot of people didn't have papers, they may be born here, but because of the colour of the skin, it was assumed that they weren't British. And they had to prove that they actually belonged here. And they were then threatened with deportation or denied employment, so they could turn up at work, trying to work in a factory, and they would say, where's your proof that you live here? And they would sometimes they weren't able to work. This also meant that their families were threatened with destitution. And also, this 1914 Nationality Act also meant that if you were a British woman and you married someone who was not British, you would lose your nationality and so would your children. And that wasn't reversed until 1948. But as all of these rules were in place, we began to see an increasing ethnic minority population here. And these examples are in the north of Ireland, Northern Ireland. So international students came to Belfast in the 1940s. We have Ugandan students here in the 1960s, and there's some Nigerian students in Queens in 1959. So when we talk about newcomer communities, this is long before I was born. We're talking 50 years ago. We also had a number of black DI units because of the segregation in America. The entire units were segregated, so we have white units and we have black units. And a number of these units were actually billeted to Northern Ireland, so we've got one. This is actually the one in the text and the one in the picture, two different units. I wasn't able to find which unit that the picture was. So they were settled throughout Northern Ireland, and the particular example there was in Dunmurry, Antrim and Spring Hill. And they were subject to American laws and American restrictions. So it was actually one of them was killed in Antrim during the war for he had a relationship with a white woman and got into a fight with a white GI who shot him. Unfortunately, so there's all of the American politics was kind of brought over here, and also especially for Beverly. Since the 1930s, we also brought successive waves of health workers came over, including from the Caribbean, as nurses. And by 1954, more than 3,000 Caribbean women were training in British hospitals. Unfortunately, because of the prejudice against them, they were placed in a 2-year course, which was of less value than the other course that other people were able to go on, which meant that they weren't able to work, they weren't able to go back and work, and they couldn't go home, so they tended to stay. But because of the isolation and the racism that they faced, they tend to migrate to London and to some of the bigger towns. And that's something that has really stayed true, and now we still heavily rely on NHS recruitment abroad, which is the highest 30%. And of course, you've all heard of the Windrush generation. That's all the Caribbean immigrants that came to the UK, and very few of them came to Northern Ireland, but it's made a massive impact in the UK, in mainland UK, and how that affected us here and migrants here all over the UK was the introduction of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1963. Again, moral panic, all these foreigners coming over was the thing, and unfortunately one of the guys leading that was Enoch Powell, who was from here, and he and others pushed for this act, and it restricted immigration to the UK, and you really had to only come if you had a job secured. And so I mentioned the DIs, I mentioned the arrival of students. At one point, 10% of the students in Dublin, the universities, were from African and ethnic minority backgrounds. And what that meant as well was also I mentioned the laws as well. You couldn't actually get married until 1948. So what we saw increasingly was that Irish women were becoming pregnant and they were not able to marry. And because of the prejudice against them, they were taken off them, or they either went to London and had their children, or they came to Mother and baby homes. This is really, really grim reading. There hasn't been much research in the north, but in the report into mother and baby homes down south, they have a specific focus on ethnic minority children, on black children. Children restricted their identity, and in significant cases, even of their ethnicity and language, as a result of their status at birth. When it came to the child's records, religious orders did not record the ethnicity of the child's parents, and the default description African was used. And there's one here. I was never told that I had a black mother, and it's really, unfortunately, I haven't released this in full, but it's been leaked, and I do encourage you to go and look at some of those examples because it's very depressing. Rosemary and Asa, she's been fantastic at raising awareness on this, but what these children have been put through is horrific, and they're still not seen as Irish. Of course, it would be Northern Ireland if we didn't talk about the Troubles, and I'm nearly done here, because I want to let the rest of the story be told by everybody else. There were over 30 Troubles victims from ethnic minority and traveller backgrounds. We tend to think of the Troubles as being exclusively about, again, the orange and green. We forget that there were business owners, there were people killed, there were businesses damaged here in Northern Ireland. This example is Max Okunda. He was a 35-year-old Belfast-based accountant. He was coming home from a client in Ballymena, and he was killed in the Dunmurry train boat bombing. He was the first African civilian and only Nigerians had been killed in the Troubles, and he left his daughter there. And unfortunately, his daughter had to leave Northern Ireland because of the racism that she faced. There were also a number of others killed, and most of them were part of the British Army. So post-conflict, yes, it's undoubtedly true. The numbers of black and ethnic minority people have increased with the arrival of the immigrant communities since the ceasefires. There are many estimates, but we're not going to really know until 2021 census how many there actually is. Oops, sorry. That's important. We have seen major changes in demographics in recent years, but it's important to recognise the historical presence of different ethnic and religious groups in Northern Ireland who've been present in Northern Ireland for many decades. The year 2000 was 20 years ago. 1980 was 40 years ago. And we still talk about newcomer communities. There's nothing newcomer about a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. These groups have been present in Northern Ireland for many decades, even before the formation of Northern Ireland itself. Their stories are a part of the history of Northern Ireland, not apart from that. Where would our NHS be without these contributions? And we have to not only just focus on statistics, because we're seeing people as visa categories and different things. We're forgetting the stories, the skills and the education that they bring to the table and their contributions to this country. And I know it's going to be touched on later on today, but it's important to note that Race Relations Order was only introduced to Northern Ireland in 1997, 32 years after the rest of the UK. And that was deliberate because we felt, that the politicians at that time felt it wasn't needed here because our population, ethnic minority population, was too small to count. And I'm here to tell you, it doesn't matter how small, they should count. And since 2015, the number of racial hate crimes have exceeded those of sectarian hate crimes. If that had been any other group of the population, I think it would never leave the headlines. The fact that we still use newcomer communities ignores the existing minority communities who've been here for generations. They're newcomer individuals, but they're integrating into the whole of society. When does someone stop being a newcomer? The focus on the two communities is other. They're literally at an institutional level. You're either the PUL, the CNR, or you're an other. It's literally institutionalised in our society. This binary orange and green excludes Northern Irish people who do not fit in boxes. It ignores the diversity that exists in Northern Ireland and just counts part of the community as another. Not really belonging, not really contributing. This is institutionalised, as I said, but it's also cultural. 4th and 5th generations here still get asked, where are you really from? No, where are you really from? So we need to think, and this is my challenge to you. How can we recognise minority ethnic, black people and minority religious people in our conception of Northern Ireland? including the historical narratives, as well as the present day.
Thank you, Naomi and Ben, for a great recap of Black history. As Martin Luther King said, he said he had a dream, and his hope was that we'll someday in the future be able to sit with Black people, white people, people of different race, we able to sit in the same room to have this conversation. So I'm really glad that we are here. We are, how do I put this? We are realizing the future, the dream we had. There's so much to learn, and as a young student who has migrated to Ireland, I know about my history because I was fortunate enough to have parents and grandparents that told me stories like this. But I worry for my siblings that were born here, that no matter how much stories you tell them, they can't comprehend such information because it's just too much. So this is why days like this are important to me, and this is one of the reasons why I'm here today, because I feel like we all have, like Bishop said earlier, he said, never underestimate or overestimate the change that you can have. So thank you so much, Naomi and Berry, for this recap.
Our next speaker is Dr. Livingstone Thompson. Dr. Livingstone is the chairperson of the African and Caribbean Support Organization and a newly appointed chairperson of the Racial Equality Subgroup at the Executive Office. We are honored to have Dr. Livingstone here today. Dr. Livingstone engaged in discussions around the UN Decade of African Descent. He has been resolute in the pursuit of justice for the people of African descent. Please welcome Dr. Livingstone.
Hi friends, I hope you can hear me very well. It's my pleasure to be here, and Lillian, thank you for the work of the Northwest Migrant Forum, and we do appreciate what the forum represents as an example of what it means to be engaging in those issues about community development and fostering and deepening, ensuring the kind of embedding of those issues relating to the presence of ethnic minorities in Northern Ireland. The issue of the UN Decade for People of African Descent is part of what I would like to focus on today. And I am pleased that after some time of insisting that the UN Decade for People of African Descent is an important focus and framework for us to work with as part of the broader strategy relating to racial equality strategy, but also relating to the issue of racism, that gradually there is an appreciation of this. It is, of course, a disappointment that the UK government at a formal level feels it is not necessary to recognize the UN Decade for People of African Descent. It is also my hope that the Northern Ireland Executive will, in the remaining period, years to 2024, that relates to this international decade, will at least seek to initiate those things which can, in a sense, help us to reckon with this issue about the UN Decade and to see what goes after that. So there is a correlationship between the UN Decade for People of African Descent and Black history. The UN Decade for People of African Descent is really a call to reckon with Black history. And the UN is particularly insistent that how to undertake those things that repair the historic perception and the way in which the people of African descent has been dealt with, that this is critical. So to put some faces to to those who have been part of the Black history struggle throughout the generations. We go back to Toussaint in Haiti, because he led the Haitian Revolution, which was essentially an attempt to end the oppression of the Haitian people by the French. But he's not the only example of those who were seeking to end oppression. We think about Nanny in Jamaica. Nanny is a national hero in Jamaica, a heroine in Jamaica, and her struggle was about British enslavement of men and women of people of African descent in Jamaica. We probably know more about Tubman and Parks and King and Mandela and Nyerere in Tanzania and Tutu in South Africa. These are individuals who represent what we call the struggle through the ages. But why, in a sense, has this struggle continued? I come to my favorite set of questions so that you will ponder. I wonder how many people know about an estimate of the number of individuals that have been trafficked, that were trafficked by enslavers in Europe during the period of the slave trade. Any idea? Any guess? Yes?
1 million?
1 million, you said. Any other guess?
12 million.
12 million. What did you say? Yeah?
63.
63. You're closer to 63 because according to the UN estimate, about 50 million people were trafficked by European countries during the time of the period of enslavement. 50 million people translocated forcefully, and that has not been reckoned. And it is part of that reason why the UN has said that nations of the world need to take cognizance of what it means to have forcibly translocated and moved 50 million people. Here's another question for you. There is a year that I'm looking for when up to which it was still legal for the UK Crown, the government in the UK and others to legally hold individuals as slaves. Do you know the year that that became legal? Yes?
1904?
That's not a bad guess, but it was a little earlier than that. Any other guess? And who knows when it was still legal? Any other? The year is actually 1833. Up to 1833, when the law was passed and was promulgated in 1834, the Queen and her cortege, the British members of Parliament, individuals, all of who have been slave owners over the years, from the crown to the pauper, are part of what it means to have been enslavers over the years. And it was only abolished in 1834. Why it was abolished will come to in a little while. People in Northern Ireland, as newly represented, were owners of slaves. And according to the claim for compensation, they have lost their property, so they were now seeking compensation. About how many people do you think they claim compensation for? People on this island? Any guess? Let's get a guess.
3,000?
3,000. This is actually quite more than that. So about 107 families claimed compensation for 16,000 people who were held as slaves on this island only. Okay? So we know. So what they indicate for people of African descent is saying we need to reckon with the history, and that history I'll say a little bit more in a little while. So what do we know about the enslavement of people? What we want, in a sense, to appreciate is that the racism as we understand it today, we misunderstand it if we think racism is really about race only. Racism essentially has its grounding in the economy. It was the basis on which the society was organized for people to make money. So fundamentally, racism is an economic problem. And so when, for example, in the racial equality strategy, we have issues like ethnic monitoring that is important, the issues relating to the hate crime legislation, that these are important. One of the things which the strategy does not sufficiently recognize is the economic substructure upon which racism is based. And unless we address issues of economy, racism will continue. Racism is about money, people benefiting from it. It started because a group of enslavers from Europe felt they could make money by not paying people to work, they could just force them to work. So it was about earning without having to pay. Unless we understand that economic substructure, I think, in a sense, we miss the point. So, what we're talking about when we talk about racism, in a sense, we are wanting people to understand that it is not going to be repaired and addressed until we begin to put our money beside the problem. And I'm not in any way, I'm not blushing or impressed by the strategies and the talk, which is really about anything about putting the money into the problem. It is about recognizing. And when the UN Decade for People of African Descent, in a sense, was promulgated, what it talked about was how, therefore, there are certain things that need to be repaired. And one of those things would be the economy. But before I come to that, let me give you an idea. And there's a name I'm going to call here today, a woman by the name of Mary Prince. I don't know how many of you have heard of her. I'd like to put a name to a woman who was enslaved. Mary Prince is now the national heroine of Bermuda. She became a national heroine in about 2019. She was sold as an enslaved girl for 38 pounds and about 12. Let me read you a part of her story as she talked about it. Before I entered the house, two slave women, hired from another owner, who were at work in the yard, spoke to me and asked who I belonged to. I replied, I am come here to live. Poor, poor child, they said. You must keep a good heart if you are to live here. When I went in, I stood up crying in a corner. Mistress I, who was evidently her owner, came and took off my hat. A little hat, black silk hat, Miss Pruden made for me, and said in a rough voice, you are not come here to stand in corners and cry. You're come here to work. She put a child in my arms, and tired as I was forced instantly to take up my old occupation of a nurse. I could not bear to look at my mistress. Her countenance was stern. She was a stout, tall woman, and her brows were always drawn together in a frown. Two slave women, whom I saw, Mrs. I, and heard the harsh words, heard sound of her voice. I got a fright that night. I was just going to sleep when I heard a noise in my mistress's room, and she presently called out to inquire if some work was finished that she had ordered Hetty to do. No, ma'am, not yet, was Hetty's answer. Hetty was another woman who was working as an enslaved woman in the house. On hearing this, my master started up from his bed, and just as he was in his shirt, ran downstairs with a long cow skin, that is a kind of a whip that was made from the whip was made from the hide of the cow, in his hand. I heard immediately after the cracking of the thumb, and the house rang to the shrieks of poor Hetty, who kept crying out, "Oh, Massa, Massa, dead Massa, have mercy upon me, don't kill me." This was a sad beginning for me. I sat up in my blanket, trembling with terror, like a little frightened hound, thinking that my turn would come next. At length the house became still, and I forgot for a little while all my sorrows by falling asleep. There were 2 little boys in the house, on whom she vented bad temper in a special manner. One of these children was a mulatto called Cyrus, who had been brought while an infant in his mother's arm, but been bought while an infant in his mother's arm. The other, Jack, was an African from the coast of Guinea, whom a sailor had given or sold to my master. Seldom a day passed without these boys receiving the most severe treatment, and often for no fault at all. Both my master and mistress seemed to think that they had a right to ill-use them at their pleasure, and very often accompanied their commands with blows, whether the children were behaving well or not. I have seen their flesh rag and raw with licks, lick. They were never secure one moment from a blow, and their lives were passed in continual fear. My mistress was not contented with using the whip, but often pinched their cheeks and arms in the most cruel manner. My pity for these boys were soon transferred to myself, for I was licked and flogged and pinched by pitiless fingers in the neck and arms, exactly as they were. To strip me naked, to hang me up by my wrist and lay flesh upon with a cow skin was an ordinary punishment for even a slight offense. My mistress often robbed me 2 of the hours that belonged to sleep. She used to sit up very late, frequently, even until morning, and I had them to stand at the bench and watch during the greater part of the night, or pick up wool and cotton, and often I had dropped down over my sleep by sleep and fatigue, till roused from a state of stupor by the whip and forced to start up to my tasks. Mary Prince wrote this account of her life in 1831. Read the story of Mary Prince. And it is for an example like this, my friend, what we're saying to the Irish state, we need to reckon with the way in which people of African descent have been treated. And there are a number of challenges that we face in regard to this decade. First of all, recognize the links to the forced relocation and enslavement of Africans. There's a certain piece of honesty that needs to happen. Recognize the unrepaired injustice associated with the forced relocation and enslavement. Recognize the unrepaired economic injustice perpetrated with the state's compensation for the plantation owners only. Did you know that it was only in 2015 that the debt taken by the UK government to pay the planters in 1834 for their having lost the labor of the enslaved people, that debt was repaid in 2015. So consider what it meant for my forebears who came as people in the Windrush generation, for example, to the UK. They continue to pay in their taxes to pay back for having gotten their freedom. 2015. So what we're saying, in other words, recognize that economic injustice. Recognize, for example, that the economic advancement of Europe, and not least in the UK, when they shifted, 1940s, the shift went into mid-England, to the industries in mid-England. The capitalists moved their money that they had earned from the enslaving of people into the industries in UK. And that is what provided the basis, the engine for the economic, or what you may call the Industrial Revolution. And it is only now that researchers working in the University College London are beginning to recognize that what Eric Williams wrote in Capital and Slavery in the 1960s, it is true that the economic advancement and the development of the Industrial Revolution was because of the money that was moved out of the enslaving, out of sugar into the Industrial Revolution. We do not accept that it was out of love that slavery was abolished. It was a monetary issue. When it became recognizable that it was unsustainable, capitalists moved their money, and the laws of the England followed suit. And it was only then that the idea of ending slavery, that the likes of Wilberforce and the others were often given the recognition for this. It is because it was no longer financially viable, and it began to make sense to those who were in Parliament, and so they joined forces with civil society to say, we are supporting it. It was not out of love, it was out of money. So recognize the need to develop an informed appreciation for why people of African descent are here. So there are a number of challenges that we face, therefore, areas for action. We've heard talk about what we call reparation. Many people associate reparation with giving back or trying to find money to give to others, or give money to the countries from where the individuals would have been taken, or to the place where the development in the Caribbean has been, in a sense, stagnated because of the transfer of wealth. When we talk about reparation, we're talking about repairing. It's not about giving money, it's about recognizing and repairing. Repair in the area of equality. Ensure that similar access and outcomes in justice, education, employment, and health, that it can happen for all. Repair. There is a problem. Repair the issue relating to the issue of identity, how we respect. I hate the way in which aid agencies and others love to portray the help associated with aid being given to the country. I hope we will be able to get a good understanding of how the world economy is working today, for example, the World Bank, recognizing the reason why the World Bank, as an international funding agency, and IMF, why they work so well, is because when the loans are given, the African and Caribbean countries who are least able to afford it, they have to pay back the loans higher. When the US and Britain, they want to borrow money, they'll get it at 1%. When Jamaica or Nigeria want to borrow money, they have to pay for it at 10%. So they are the ones still subsidizing the world economy as it is, and we say there's underdevelopment happening. We have to follow the money, friends. Follow the money. So there is a need for the repair of the economy, and there is a need for us to repair society. What we are asking, and certainly from the point of view of the UN, from the African and Caribbean Support Organization, we are very clear that what we are looking to see in a society as this is what we call a society where racism is not tolerated, where we see it being modeled in the words that people use, whether it be the Minister of Government or otherwise. The words that they use and they portray, they create the atmosphere it is not tolerated. The UN Decade for People of African Descent is about justice, recognition, and development. And that is what we're calling for. Let it be recognized. We have until 2024 to start something. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Livingstone. I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation around the UN Decade for African Descent in Northern Ireland, and I hope that areas of action is listed up on the screen, that we can begin to sit down and have meaningful conversation that will impact not just the society, but like I said, the economy of Northern Ireland and the living condition of people of different race in this country.
I hope that the Minister was listening to the recommendations and he will take concrete action to implement some of these recommendations. We will wholeheartedly accept. Now can I call on the Minister, Gary Middleton, to speak, please. Round of applause, please.
Thank you, and thank everyone for the kind invitation to come along, and particularly I want to thank Deborah and Naomi for their contributions, and indeed Dr. Livingston as well. I want to wish him well in his role as chair of the Race Equality Subgroup, and I look forward to engaging with him and the other subgroup members on the 16th of November at our next meeting. It is indeed an honour for me to represent the Executive Office here today, and I want to thank Bishop Forster and Bishop McEwen and the North West Migrants Forum for your invitation to come along today, and for the invitation for the ministerial colleagues. It is impossible to acknowledge the significance of Black History Month without also acknowledging and remembering the incalculable historical damage and trauma that Black people have had inflicted upon them through history. It may be an uncomfortable and a bitter truth to many, but it is a truth and one which we must be open and honest about. The treatment and the cruel exploitation upon the continent of Africa and the African diaspora was and indeed is shameful. The history of slavery and racism should be taught and remembered, and importantly the lessons learned applied to the 21st century. So today's event will be one small step towards that goal, and something I very much welcome the opportunity to be at. Without the ongoing contribution of our Black community, our world would be a very different place today. And yet, this contribution and significance is rarely acknowledged. Instead, it is often ignored, misrepresented, and unfortunately, it's even sidelined. One legacy, of course, of this is the continuation of racism, hate crimes, the vilification and diminishing of life, opportunities, and chances of minority ethnic people today. The fact that racism still persists in the 21st century, it's actually really disheartening, it's frustrating, bewildering, and it's something I personally want to see change. Yet, whilst we still have a lot to do, I believe that through the racial equality strategy, we have started to and continue to make progress on key issues. We have established the racial equality subgroup and the racial equality champions to ensure that racial equality is very much embedded within government policy. We also plan to consult on legislation to replace the Race Relations Order ending next year. The Minority Ethnic Development Fund has been reviewed and the report and findings are being implemented. The Crisis Fund has been increased and continues to provide immediate, flexible and vital support to the most vulnerable in society. We're also due to launch the consultation of the new refugee integration strategy very shortly, and I would encourage all of you to please take advantage of the consultation process. We very much want to hear each and every one of your voices. Officials are as well currently finalising a draft of the guidance on ethnic monitoring with a view to engaging with our racial equality subgroup and cross-departmental working groups to take forward implementation of the recommendations from the research that we commissioned. That said, of course, we know that there is much more to do, and we all need to strengthen and expedite the efforts to receive racial and achieve racial equality here. Our Permanent Secretary has just completed a very recent racial equality stocktake across all of our departments in the Executive. It has identified some of the achievements made, but importantly, it has actually identified quite a number of priorities for moving forward, which we are committed to progressing over the course of the next period. Our shared goal is to achieve racial equality